like deja vu. This entire conversation we're going to have will feel like that because for people listening, we actually had it on Tuesday in Palm Beach at the Breakers, and then there was a technical or some issue with the sound. So we're recording again. So Nicki, I appreciate your patience and willingness to come back on. And my son, for those watching on YouTube, will put up a picture to show that we were actually at the Breakers and it was nice weather. And
with
all
palm
that
trees and waterfalls and everything.
Yes.
It was great.
It was awesome, and dolphins jumping in the background and everything. So not really, but we can dream. But anyways, thank you for coming back on. And I wanted to talk about what Ron Rivera talked about at the breakfast yesterday. And then also one thing we didn't get to do is talk about Roger Goodell. That happened after we recorded. Now we can talk about that. But let's start with Ron Rivera and just some of the things he talked about. We'll start with Carson Wentz. Or first of all, let me just ask this. Your big takeaway from our 45-minute interview with Ron Rivera yesterday.
Yeah, I mean, I thought a lot of it was kind of repeating what he said when they traded for Wentz, that they really feel like he can be a solution at quarterback. Which I think when the trade was made, it was kind of viewed as, oh, maybe it's a bridge guy, a very expensive bridge guy, and he has a contract that is pretty pricey this year, especially with the cap hit, but doesn't have any guaranteed salary left, so they could move on after 1 year if it doesn't work out, and then they could get a rookie, blah, blah, blah. But Rana said from the beginning that he feels like Carson Wentz could really be, a longer term fit here. And he went into depth more at the owners' meetings, talking about how he fits the offense, how talking about his ability to make those deep throws, the quick game, and just being able to open things up in Scott Turner's system, which is something they've kind of struggled to do.
Right.
Which, when you're cycling through so many quarterbacks, that's going to be a struggle no matter what. But he has the physical traits, and he has been successful, even at points last season with the Colts and in 19, and especially in 2017, that they can point to and be like, look at this guy. He's a quality player. It's, how do you get past some of the other things that led to him getting benched and then traded from Philly and then traded from Indy again. So I thought that was kind of interesting to hear him go more in depth on how they viewed him as a fit in the scheme.
And to your point on that, I think they're not going to draft a quarterback at 11. I think that's been a big takeaway over the last couple of weeks, but it was more clear from,
which I think is a mistake, but they didn't ask my opinion.
You think that's a mistake?
I do. Because
you have the floor.
They have not found their quarterback yet. And I'm of the mind, until you find that guy, you keep getting guys. They didn't take a quarterback in the first round last year. They didn't take one in 2020, and they needed one. And they probably should have taken one in hindsight. Chase Young is a very good player, and everything is 2020 in hindsight. And everybody seemed to overlook Justin Herbert and what he could be. So I'm not knocking them there. And they had to give Dwayne Haskins a chance. There are a lot of circumstances there, but until you find that guy, I'm of the mind that you got to keep trying.
I agree with that. I think what it also suggests, though, is this aggressiveness to getting quarterbacks is an indication of how people view this class. And right. So that's where I would say too, if you think a guy is going to be there at 11, I think 11's a tough spot anyway, but if you really liked a guy, you don't have to go up too far to probably get one of these two. Because you don't have to get in the top 5, you know what I mean. So I think right. This is an indication of what people think about this class. Would you agree?
And yes, and if that's the case, why would you use a pick on a quarterback that's ranked even farther down as your third guy and prop him up as a guy that can play in 4 years? If you find that diamond in the rough, so to speak, that's great. But unless you really feel strongly that this guy can develop in 4 years and be a starter in the NFL, build your team for now. That's my thinking. Maybe that's off.
Right. And I think I would agree. I think he did say they do want to take another quarterback if they can find one as maybe even more of a possible future backup, a guy who can be a third quarterback this year. So whenever they get that guy, who knows? And I think after the first round, you can start looking at that. I also think that you look at this, and this is clearly an indication that they clearly think Carson Wentz will be their guy for at least a couple years. So, and then at that point, and this goes to some other comments that Rivera said, but maybe you make it a different place. If you can have a couple 10-win seasons because of what Wentz has done, maybe that can help get something else down the road. I don't know. Maybe it makes you be more aggressive. If you want a guy in the draft in a couple of years, you don't have to do it now. It gives you that freedom to move on to something else if you want. But I also found it interesting too, and going back to your comment about it's not just the deep ball where they like Carson Wentz. It is a lot of the underneath stuff. It's the quick game. It's those shallow crossers. And it's a big deal because like Wentz can see over the line. I mean, it's right. Taylor Heineke's shorter. He doesn't have the same arm, doesn't have the same vision. And like you talk to people about like a Drew Brees or Russell Wilson, well, they're short too, but they're really good at finding ways to create vision for themselves. Not everybody can do that. They can, and it's why it works for them. But with Wentz, it gives them that ability to open up the playbook a little bit more. And I think it may be a little bit of an understated part of it. It's not just the deep ball.
Right. No, I agree with you completely. And you can't overlook the experience too. Right. He has played in big games. He is a big reason the Eagles won that Super Bowl. He wasn't in the Super Bowl and he didn't close out the season, but he led them on an 11-2 run and was a Pro Bowl selection and second team All-Pro that year. Like he is a primary reason they went as far as they did. So I don't think you can overlook that fact. Now, is he the same player that he was then after suffering the injury? That's a fair question. And I guess that's something that is still unanswered in my view.
And I agree with you, because I think there are times where he is definitely a hero ball guy. He's going to extend the play because I mean, anybody who's watched this team, and you weren't covering the beat yet, but he had a couple plays against this team that were like, how did that happen? How did he get out of that? I don't know if he's making those plays anymore, but he, in your mindset, is still that, hey, I just did this a year ago or 2 years ago. So I think that's one of the things that teams look at him, but it's not, any quarterback who's mobile has that hero ball mentality. What did you think of, because we also heard from Frank Reich, can still be a top 10 quarterback. And the phrase can be is key. And then Jim Irsay talked and kind of dunked on him a little bit.
I know. And I think it becomes very clear then who was exactly. And why he's no longer an Indy.
Yes.
not to say that Frank Reich and Chris Ballard didn't also want to move on, but just publicly they've tempered their statements so as not to bash the kid. But I mean, Frank Reich has been with him in Philly for his first 2 seasons. Then he was with him in Indy. But I keep going back to the fact that if it didn't work with him, how is it going to work here? That's a big question. But yeah, he did speak very glowingly about who he is as, a locker room leader, a good rapport with players, thinks he can be a top 10 quarterback. Of course, Ron believes he already is a top 10 quarterback. That's a different story for a different day. But Chris Ballard has talked highly of him too. But a lot of that stuff, I keep coming back to the fact of, you paint this glowing picture of a guy. Well, then why did you get rid of him? And I think that's where Jim Irsay came in and, was, like you said, it's very clear he was the driving force, but it wasn't all roses over there with him. And it'd be interesting to hear a more balanced account.
Well, and I agree. And I think for Irsay, there was a lot about that last game against Jacksonville. And he did that. Even people here will say, he didn't play well in that game. When you watch the game, receivers weren't getting open in that game, and the line didn't do a good job either. It wasn't just a quarterback breakdown, but I do think there was a lot on that. And I think if it was just about one game, I don't think they're trading him. You would think that it wouldn't just be about one game, because that's a tough way to go. But that certainly seemed to play into Irsay's emotions about the situation. And, I did have one member of the Colts organization, unprompted, came up to me. He's like, he just kind of praised Carson Wentz about how he was in the locker room and just as a person. So, and the other thing, Nicki, too, is it's funny because there's a lot of talk about that with him. And there's all sorts of stuff out there. but I think we've both heard of other quarterbacks who are successful, who are not always popular with all their teammates.
Right. No, totally. And that's where I feel like we're not getting the full picture. And maybe there were other things going on that led to his exit both in Philly and in Indy. But yeah, it's hard to say. I just keep coming back to the fact of, this is two similar instances where he's been dealt. And in Indy, he got a shorter span. They traded for him. I mean, Philly did too, moving up in the draft, but both teams essentially traded for him and then traded him away. So, it's hard to overcome that, but Ron has a strong conviction that Justin talking to Frank Reich and Martin talking to Chris Ballard and whoever else they talk to, they feel that
Doug Peterson.
Yeah, he can overcome any of that, and they don't seem concerned at all about it. Given the state of this franchise, I think there is reason to be concerned, but mainly because there's unanswered questions about how this is going to work.
Right. And I think the last part on this for me is, and someone else pointed this out before to me a week or so ago, in Indy, the lineage that he's following is Peyton Manning, Andrew Luck, and then Phillip Rivers for a year.
Right.
Here, I mean, it's not that. So
Right.
God bless Taylor Heineke in his story, and Garrett Gilbert was in there, and Alex Smith, terrific leader, but while he had all the leadership skills, his play on the field was not always there. So that's what he's following here. So the measuring stick for him is going to be, the bar is going to be a little bit lower. But I also think for this staff, they feel like they have a guy that they can create maybe more of a game or expand their game plan, expand what they want to do. And so we'll see. The other thing that Ron talked about is the easy target label on this franchise. And he was talking about from the football side, the way it affects them. I think he made it clear, and we'll make it clear that he wasn't talking about, he wasn't minimizing the other stuff. But I think I think for him, and it came up about because would players want to come here? And it was under that kind of theme. And I think because a lot of the attention has been on the off the field activities and the issues in Congress and all that, which is separate from them for on the field. What did you think? What did you make of all that?
Yeah, and I get where he's coming from on that, but you come into the situation, you want to fix it and move on and try to make things better. The reality is the fans of this team over the last 20 something years have been through a lot. And I think at some point you got to acknowledge that, accept that, but also try to move on. I think there's room for both here. But his point, I get, it's very, they always have their reputation hanging over them. And a lot of the folks that help build this reputation aren't there anymore on the business side, and certainly not on the football side. But the reality is this: they've had 2 losing seasons under this regime.
Right. They
have 3 pending investigations and had a 4th end last year. They've had, so it's you can't deny that. And while I'm sure it's frustrating to kind of build a better football product, while a lot of these pertain to, although the one with the DEA does not, a lot of these pertain to, past operations. That's the job he took on, and he knew this would be a challenge. I don't think he, expected some of these major ones that came up after
when he took the job. Not one of these things was there when he.
Yeah.
Was here when he took the job on was a couple of decades of not success, right? Everything else has happened there. And I think I think for him, it's like every time you start to feel like you move forward and then you take a step back, or you get pummeled, right? He told me once, he told his wife that right around the time the name changed, said they announced it's going to be on February 2nd. He told Stephanie, you watch, something's going to come out the next day or whatever. And then the next day was a roundtable session hearing. So again, I'm not even saying any of that's right or wrong, or it's not,
Yeah.
not deserving of it. I just think from a football standpoint, they obviously want to move past that. Who doesn't? I think the
Right.
fan base would like to move past that. The problem is there's some things that are still have to be dealt with. So that's still what's
Right.
going to happen and for him, it's like, is winning. And again, nobody wants to minimize any of the stuff that's going on.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
I don't, I know you don't. But for him, it's like winning is the cure. How much from a football side perception, how much winning do they need to do to move past certain reputations or perceptions?
I know you mentioned a couple seasons, others have, kind of made their predictions. I think it's going to take longer than that. And the problem there, of course, is will this regime be afforded the patience even just to do that? Now, if you win, you're going to be retained longer, but there's still going to be some bumps in the road. And, even after a couple winning seasons, if you produce that, I mean, we're talking 20 plus years. This is a marquee franchise. This was, a multiple Super Bowl winner. I mean, there's a loyal fan base. Like, it has been eroded quite a bit over the last 2 decades. So it's going to take some time to build that back up. And I think it will take longer than a couple winning seasons. I think you start to build up hope after that point. But I think a lot of people have been disappointed when they have hope. So yeah, so it requires more consistency. You're trying to dig yourself out of a pretty deep hole.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. And I think when you talk to people on the business side, you hear the word, they know they need to rebuild trust with the public, with the paying public. From a football side, everything, the hope and all that, it comes in the wins and losses. Like, that's how you measure a franchise, right? It's how they won Super Bowls. They were a great franchise. And I agree. I think it's going to take, and I think they understand it's 1 year of a 10-win season. It's like, okay, that's great, or it's better, but what are you going to do next year? You've got to follow that up. And the way you create that success is by winning multiple years like that. Look at Buffalo a few years ago. What's the perception of Buffalo? Well, what is it now? Cincinnati 2 years ago, at this time last year, what's the perception of them? What is it now? Because now, like, oh my God, Joe Burrow, and like now they're winning. And so you can do that, but it does take not just 9-8, 10-7, 10-7 playoff win, or 10-7, get in there, exciting game. And like, if they had built off the Heineke game, the Tampa game, and you come back this year and you win 10 games, people are looking. Listen, at one point you wonder, they might get to 9 wins because they were playing better. But if you go out, you've got to follow that up. If you get some momentum at the end of the year, you've got to follow it up to re-energize this fan base. And it's got to, make a playoff run, because it's since 2005, Nicki, no playoff wins. I mean, that's brutal. And this is a very proud fan base. And, you hear from people like they want to wear their Commanders gear. Still sounds funny or odd, but they want to wear just the name, but they want to wear the Commanders gear with some pride. And the only way they can do that is give me something to be proud about.
Right.
And
right. No, exactly.
So but I think that they understand that, because I've had conversations with people over there, I'm sure you have too, that you are paying for the sin, the football sins of the past.
Right.
You are paying, like, when you come here, you just got here, but like you said, the fan base has been here. So while you may say, why is everybody so impatient? The fan base can say, because of the last 20 years. Right. That's why. So and I think there's an understanding of that, because it has been more like, hey, we got to win. That's what right. So do you think there's more of a recognition of that?
I think so, because I think they understand the urgency. I mean, year 3 is a big year. Yes. And if they don't win this year, then I would imagine pretty much everybody is on the hot seat at that point. And there will have to be some pretty significant changes. But I also think it's more nuanced than that. Yes, it's the record. It's the simple wins and losses, but it's also, you look at what they accomplished in year 1. They seemed a very gritty team. Right. They produced one of the top defenses. The way they rallied late in the season, I think, was really remarkable. And to come out the way they did at the start of the second season, was really disappointing.
Correct.
You
You're
know,
right.
the defense statistically fell off. Now you could
They're
argue that
horrible.
it's not all about sacks, and we get that,
They
but
were horrible.
yeah, I mean, that line was zero communication. It felt like at times the secondary was all over the place. It's how do you have that significant drop off? You're supposed to build up. Oh boy, there go my
And
dogs.
your dogs are getting riled up about that too. They're ticked off
I
about
mean,
how they play.
it's
You know what they say?
unbelievable.
I can translate for people listening to your dogs. What the dogs are saying is they shouldn't have relied on 4-man pressure. Help Young and Sweat out by creating that pressure that you did after the fact, right?
Right.
That's what they said. I know it. I speak dog.
I had no idea. You're multilingual,
Yeah.
but and that was the biggest disappointment, at least for me, just as a viewer, right?
Yes.
Like you're gonna have some struggles in year 2. That's expected. You're still early in the rebuild, but to have that massive drop off, and that's supposed to be your strongest part,
That's a good point.
that's disappointing. And that's where, you talk about hope and getting burned, and it's going to take time for people to really believe that it's going to turn a corner this time.
Well, and I think that's a great point about the hope, because it's you go back many years and there's always like, oh my gosh, you're bringing in this free agent class. There's the hope. Or you're bringing in Joe Gibbs. There's the hope. You're bringing in Mike Shanahan. You get McNabb, you get Griffin, you get all these things, and that hope doesn't last long enough. And this time the hope was, this is a top 10, top 5 defense.
Right.
And oh my God, Chase Young's going to redo this for the position. And I still think, I still solidly believe this defense can be really good.
Oh,
I think
absolutely.
They had a really good stretch of the season.
Not to be.
Right. And I think Chase Young can still be very, very good. But that was the bubble burst at the end of the start. If they had lost those games, but the defense is shutting them down and the offense isn't moving, it's like, well, it's kind of what you expected in a little bit.
Right.
But so,
people bring up the Russell Wilson thing a lot, why maybe he didn't want to come to Washington. He turned that down and he chose Denver. You could compare the rosters, whatever. They had losing seasons.
Or the proximity to LA and his wife want,
right.
So there could be all sorts of reasons we don't know.
Right.
We don't know.
But, the fan base there, I mean, they had a sellout streak before the pandemic. That was years. It was the longest home sellout streak in the NFL. They have a 30-year something wait list for season tickets. They had losing seasons, but they had 5-6 losing seasons since Peyton Manning. So restoring that hope when another great quarterback comes in is not, I'm kind of speculating here, but I would imagine it's not that hard, not as hard as Washington, because it wasn't that long ago that they had a Super Bowl champion, where they were in two Super Bowls in the span of 3 years. They've won with John Elway, they've won with Peyton Manning, they can win with Russell Wilson, perhaps. They have, they've done a lot, and they've become more of a consistent winner in the past few decades, whereas Washington, they haven't had that in years.
Right.
And they've had opportunities where it's, maybe now, nope, maybe now, nope. So it's going to take longer for them to really be convinced that it's going to change this time. So
and I think you see that with some players who Von Miller is not going to Buffalo a couple of years ago.
Right. Exactly.
That's a difference. Yeah. And so like I say, the quarterback makes all that difference.
It really does.
The Bills have a very good organization. Beam, McDermott, all that, but the quarterback makes the difference.
Yeah.
And that's where and see, your dog agrees with that.
Joey knows.
So you get that, and that's a definite byproduct. And that's why I think with Wentz, if he can become, it's hard to call him, as you said, maybe he's a bridge, maybe he's not, but he's getting him a bridge to somewhere. It may just be to get him to that 10-11 win mark, like Kansas City did with Alex Smith. And then you're really aggressive going after your version of Mahomes or whomever, right? If in a couple of years you feel like he's not getting us beyond, if they are thinking he's not getting us beyond this point, now we have to go do something else. But if you can get that 10-11 win range, it gives you that, it starts to turn your reputation around. And so that is what's needed. And part of that reputation involves Chase Young. I thought it was interesting that Rivera talked about how he had talked to Chase and that he would be at the OT, or that he would be at the offseason work. What did you make of all that?
I mean, I thought that was really interesting. And, you know, Ron won't go too far publicly because they're voluntary and you can't make players go to these things, but he's made it pretty clear, right? He's made it very clear that he wants guys there because it's not just about, you know, showing up and lifting weights with your, you know, and just being there. Like, you know, Chase and Montez Sweat, they were getting training. It wasn't like they're just skipping out. That's not how it works. It's more of being a leader, being around your teammates, building that chemistry early, so you can really get to work, you know, when camp opens on the football X's and O's part. And that's what he's been stressing to Chase. So you know, it's very clear. It's important for, in Ron's mind, for everybody to be there. So, you know, from what he said, it sounds like Chase is planning to be there now. In what capacity he's actually able to participate in these things, that's a different story. He's coming off the ACL injury. He's been spending a lot of time recovering in Colorado. And we'll see where he's at in his rehab, where he's at health-wise, but he's expecting him to be there and be around his teammates.
He also called I mean, see, we're talking about defense and quarterbacks. Your dogs get excited, defense and quarterbacks. But with Chase, because Ron did call it an awakening. 2021 was an awakening for him. And that's where I'll be curious to see how he responds to that, because the talent is still immense. I mean, it was more maybe the approach from a pass rusher standpoint, or from, and I think it seems like what they also want from him is, one, to be around the guys, but also when you're installing defense, and then what are you working on? You know, because there were some things that Chase worked on as far as pass rush moves that I'm pretty sure they would prefer he had taken a different approach or tactic with it. So I wonder if that's not part of it too. But I think it's a good sign that those two seem to have a pretty good dialogue going with each other. It seems, do you think, or no?
I mean, it seems like it at this point. We haven't heard a ton from Chase. I think we've talked to him once, maybe, since you know, his injury
before the Super Bowl.
Yeah. So it seems like it. You hope so. Martin Mayhew said he's been in contact too with Chase, and
Chase is sending Ron Rivera videos of his workout.
Yeah. And I think that's paramount. I think the relationship between Ron and Chase is so important to like the growth of this team, because Ron is the primary leader and Chase is the number 2 leader, you know, when you look at it on paper. So you need them to be in sync. And whenever you feel like they're not in sync, that's when I felt like this could be a problem, you know, when there was any perceived discord over the off-season workouts. You're like, this may not go well, because, you know, those are your 2 leaders of the team.
Right. And it also matters, Nicki, too, as you know, if a guy produces during the season, it's like, well, we'd like him here, but dude had 16 sacks. I mean, you know what I mean? But when you only get the 1.5, now the injury certainly disrupted that. And he only played half the year because of the injury. But in that half year, he was not as productive as he was in the second half of his rookie year. I mean, he was fantastic at that stretch. So I think that's where it's like, it's always, you know, if you didn't produce the way people had hoped, was this part of it? Well, maybe, you know, we'll find out. But I think the thing for them that they like is the way they feel Chase has responded to it.
Right. Yeah. And I think, you know, I think it's something that a lot of top players have gone through, and some of them need to go through. Like I go back to Von Miller mainly because I was around him a lot. But he's an exceptional pass rusher, obviously. Came in, immediately had an impact, put up monster numbers his rookie season, but had to go through some stuff off the field to really kind of change who he was as a person over the years. You know, suspended for trying to get out of a drug test, and dealt with a season-ending injury too. And, you know, by, 4 years later, he's a captain and, you know, is reinstated out of the drug program and really does what he needs to do to get that side of things in order to really become the face of the franchise. And, you know, Chase hasn't gotten into trouble or anything, but I think sometimes you just need to be humbled a little bit and realize for some, I don't know if this is the case for Chase, know what you don't know and what you need to work on, because it's not the same as college. Everybody, they say this and it's cliche, but it's true. It's like, the greatest player in college is pretty much everybody in the NFL, so it's going to be challenging. There's going to be hard parts, but you got to learn to overcome that. So I think having this early in his career, you hope will kind of set him up just for continued growth.
And I never mind if a guy struggles early on, and just, you don't take it, because for me, it's always, how do you respond to situation X? If you have success, how do you respond? Do you build on that? Do you coast? How do you respond? You get a big contract. How do you respond? You have a bad year. How do you respond? You have it, it's on down the line. So this game is all about how do you respond to whatever situation you encounter, because if you don't respond in a certain way, it's going to knock you back again. And so knowing enough about Chase, I think that he seems like a guy who definitely cares about having success. And it's not everybody does. I mean, not to a certain level. And so that's why I think we'll see. And then, staying on the defense, just a few more minutes here, because we're taping this again, and this is a lot of time for you, so I appreciate it. Cole Holcomb, the one thing consistently through the offseason that I know I've heard, and I'm sure you have heard, is they want, and they've been public about it too. It's not, but it's been public and private that they're saying the same thing: middle linebacker. Right. And and I know there was a desire. I know there was always a part like, well, Cole could do it, and he did all right. Well, now the message from Martin Mayhew and Ron Rivera was, hey, Cole looks better than we thought. I mean, how real do you think that is? And what did you take away from that? Because part of me wonders, well, maybe they don't know if they can get their guy. And now you got to make sure that you've got to, that you're not abandoning the guy who may have to play it.
Right. I think part of this is kind of respinning the narrative more than anything. It's like, he at the end of the season, Ron flat out said, when they had David Mayo, a true Mike linebacker, come in late in the year, it made others around him better. It made Cole Holcomb better from the outside. And Cole at the time said he would like to be considered as more of that full-time Mike player. Right. But Ron seemed to indicate that that's not how they viewed him. That's not where they viewed him as, that's not where he played his best.
Ron Rivera, former linebacker, Ron Rivera.
Correct. Right. Whose defensive coordinator is also a linebacker, whose linebackers coach won 2 rings as a linebacker. Right. Anyway, but, that's not how they viewed him. And that's not what they said publicly. And then all of a sudden they come to the owners' meetings, and they picked a great time. They come to the owners' meetings and and now all of a sudden they view Cole Holcomb as an option. Oh, we went back and watched the tape. I don't fully believe that, as if you weren't watching the tape in season. Right. But at this point on the roster, who else do they have? It's him and Mayo. Jamin Davis, who they drafted in the first round last year, they view him now as better suited to play outside, not to be that Mike guy. So there are some options in free agency, but they're pricey, and it doesn't look like they're headed that way. The draft is very good for this year, but sorry, Joey, pipe down.
We'll stop talking about defense in a minute. No,
he's getting them riled up about linebackers.
Somebody's got to bark out the signals, Nicki.
Jeez. But I think a lot of it is kind of reshaping the narrative, but they also are coming to the reality that, Cole actually might be an option because they don't have much else at this point.
And he did actually get better in the middle. You could see the times where he was not hesitating quite as much in some instances as he was early, but everything you always hear, he's a more natural outside linebacker. So I still am going to buy that because that's what I've heard consistently. But I also think, Nicki, it points to the position they really, really, really want to fill, maybe even more than middle linebacker, is that Buffalo nickel.
Right.
And that, because they were using that, it was more than 50% of the time. That was that essentially was their primary look. And they felt that when the defense took a big hit when Landon Collins got hurt at the end of the year.
Right. And so now Landon Collins is gone. So yeah, I think that's the biggest position. And that's the one we've heard the least about from this.
Right. But I think that's a legit thing. And by the way, Landon is still unsigned. Just saying.
Potential return.
Well, no, listen,
Yeah.
this is and that's a spot where there are guys in the draft who can fill that role. And, and if you don't get that guy in the draft, then what do you do after the draft? Because that is a spot they absolutely want to fill. And there are a few ways they can go with that. And you could draft somebody who can move Cam Curl to that role because he's a very smart player. But that's where I only bring up that position because that is the one that you may hear is one that they really, really want to fill. And whereas linebacker, like, well, if you can't find the guy, then you do have Cole who can play there, but you still need to add depth at linebacker. I don't care whatever they do. They've got to add more linebackers. They don't have any depth. And that's a thing that is very evident to me. And we'll see what happens, but that's why I say that Buffalo nickel one is still also one to watch as well, whatever direction they go. But again, Kyle Hamilton could play that, could play in there too. And if he falls to 11, and he would be an attractive guy for that. But the other thing is Roger Goodell goes, and you asked him the question about Dan Snyder and the day-to-day operations, et cetera. There's a pretty, the impact, the meaty part of the quote was pretty small. It was just, they don't see him being in that role for the foreseeable future. What did you take away from that?
Yeah, I mean, some of it requires clarification. I asked Goodell, what is Dan's status with the team? Because when they announced the Wilkinson findings, that they said that Dan would step back from day-to-day operations for the next several months. They didn't put a concrete timeline on it. They just said Tanya would take over the day-to-day and Dan would focus more on stadium and other matters. Well, it's been several months. So what's up now, especially with more investigations ongoing? And yeah, he said he doesn't believe Dan has been at the facilities. And first off, that was never publicly stipulated when they announced all this. And he has been around in certain spurts. He does go to games. And he was at the team's rebranding announcement at FedEx Field. But at the end of Goodell's comment, he said, Tanya's been here representing the team at league activities, and I don't foresee that. I don't think that's going to change for at least the foreseeable future. And at that point, Dan and I would talk about it, which two things there: that he's still not a part of the day-to-day, not supposed to be part of the day-to-day operations. And his return would have to include a conversation with the commissioner first, which to me implies that it's not solely his decision of when he could resume full control of the franchise if he wanted to.
So if this was like an injury report, it'd be Snyder, investigation, return questionable.
Correct. Yes.
But not to make light of this, but and the one thing, going back to the original thing, and at the time they were very strong in saying this is not a suspension. But it's certainly there was an alteration of roles because Tanya Snyder has represented them at league functions. And I think when they talk about league functions, it's league meetings like the one we just attended, and they didn't say he couldn't go to certain things. He just wasn't going to be involved in daily operations. Is a game a day-to-day operation? Well, I think it's a weekly thing. I don't know. They clearly don't view it that way because he was going to games. And if you're going to have the announcer for the thing, and I don't know that qualifies as being involved in daily operations. I don't know how they view it because we even saw after that, it was Tanya Snyder who was addressing employees on the field later in that day, if you remember. And
and Tanya was at Carson Wentz's introductory presser. It was just Tanya. Dan wasn't there. But Ron has said he talks to both Snyders about long-term deals. Again, the league did not publicly specify. It just said the stadium and other matters. It was perceived to be like longer-term, bigger projects, but it wasn't specified.
Right. And I do think he's been at the facility once or twice, but not, I think maybe just to go watch practice. I think he was here when Norv was here one time. But it has not been a constant presence, that's for sure. So, and where this goes, I don't know. And it doesn't seem like anything was going to move it beyond getting him out of there. I think, but the other thing is, and this is my fault for not asking this question, and I talked about this with you later, and I tried to ask a question at the end, but I got my hand up too late a couple of times. But I wish I had asked that, because again, several months, but was the Tiffany Johnson allegations, did that almost say, okay, we're going to keep extending this until that is wrapped up? Did that extend it? Was there something that kind of precipitated a longer change in the way he conducts his business with the franchise? I don't know. And we don't know the timeline of the current investigation. Usually they would just say it's ongoing. We don't know if it's, although even last year in April, in the Super Bowl, he started saying it was close to the end, and it was July when it was announced. So who knows, but that's still, so I always wonder about that. But I wish I had asked that question, because you had the big one, and I wish we had asked that I wish I had asked that one, but unfortunately I didn't think about that direct one.
Way to go, Keim.
I mean, it was, not day late Johnny on that one, but I wasn't very happy about that. But the other part, last thing for this, and I appreciate as always your time. I owe you. The locker room going to be open. That Drew, you're not supposed to cheer in the press box, but there was cheering in that meeting when Brian McCarthy, league spokesman, said the locker rooms will be open this year. I don't think people always quite understand why that's a big deal for us. Why, let's tell them. You tell me.
Yeah. It's a weird setting. I don't think any of us really want to be in that setting when guys are getting dressed, but this is where players are more themselves, or they're comfortable. This is where, you can get them as more human beings. You can start to build those relationships, when it's just podiums or Zooms. Think of it from a player's perspective. You're staring out to a dozen cameras and 20 something reporters at a time. You're going to be very calculated. You're going to hold some, and we're not digging for dirt. It's just, it's hard to get to know them as people as well as football players. But when it's more of a casual conversation, and unfortunately that's one of the few settings where you can have those, given the access level in the NFL, they're important. When you only have those podiums, it's hard for them to really know, who are these people? What are they trying to get? What is their agenda? And what do they want to learn about me? And it's understandable how those walls can build up between players and media. So this is an important time just for getting to know players, and for players to getting to know us as media, as people. And I think that's very important for storytelling and being able to accurately portray what's going on with the team, what's going on with the players, to tell both, a lot of the good things too of what they're doing, and what's going on. Yeah. No, I mean, you learn about some of the stuff they're doing off the field that you don't really get a chance to ask about in these pressers, Right.
There's a lot that you get to learn about them. There were a couple plus again, I think you brought up too, and it's important for us to get to know them, but they need to get to know us, and what is this guy's approach? And I go back to the Bobby McCain little mini rant after the Atlanta game, hey, whatever, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but bring that same energy when we start playing well. And he was getting really upset. And I remember my first thought was, if we had been in the locker room, we'd be talking to Bobby throughout this. He would be able to explain certain things to us about, this is what we're going through, or maybe we can ask him some questions okay, I get where Nicki or John or Ben are coming from with that question, because I've gotten to know him a little bit. And that's not always going to be the case. It's not going to diffuse everything, but it does give you a deeper level of understanding of what we're looking for. It's hey, we're not trying to dig up dirt. You're just trying to sometimes explain. Listen, people listening want to know what happened. What does the locker room think? Well, we can't tell you unless you're in there. That's one, but it is important. And what they see, if people are going to watch, you see these clips of interviews where there's 10 people around a guy and all that. Well, that's a snippet from the locker room. Those locker room sessions are 45 minutes. And during that time, there's a lot of downtime. When Chris Thompson was here, we got to know him really well because you just had talks at his locker. You can talk to Terry McLaurin about, hey, I can talk about Ohio State football, right? But it develops that. And, Capri Bibbs, when he was here, you could talk to him wow, you lived with how many people? he grew up in a house with 22 kids and he's bouncing around and he made it to the NFL. That becomes a story. Adrian Peterson sitting there eating a honey bun during an interview. We can talk to him about junk food afterwards. Like, here's one of the greatest running backs of all time, but you get to know him on a different level, and it's just casual, fun conversations, and they get to become comfortable with you. And there's, like John Bostic. I remember talking to him about a couple of years ago. I'm like, you talk to him, you stop talking. He's like, you're really smart. You want to go into coaching? He's like, and he starts talking about real estate. And so I think Rhiannon Walker turned that into a story last year about or something like with his real estate holdings. But that's a good story that you learn from being in the locker room. You wouldn't get that otherwise. And so there's a lot of things that you get from that.
Right. It's all about trust building, and it works both ways. And it's very hard to do that when you got a screen in the middle, or you have to do it with a couple questions at a podium in front of everybody. It's
not ideal.
Then everybody just becomes an object to another person, and that's not how it should be.
We're just a face in the crowd, and if I would want, and plus, like if you end up writing a certain story about a guy, you also want to go in there and face them if they want to say something to you, to just like, hey, that's not what happened, or hey, you had this wrong, or whatever. You go into a room and you're just part of a room, and it's you want to be, if we do something, you're held accountable, right? And I go back to, like, you're right, like nobody truly wants to be in there when guys are dressing. That's not the thing, and there's, unfortunately, they haven't figured out another way to have an open situation where guys are around, because if you say, well, just do it at this time, or go have a separate room. Well, guys don't go into that room. And so then it's, and not everybody likes us in there. We know that. Some guys don't want us in there at all.
You don't like being in there with them. So it's
but I like getting to know them, and I like them getting to know us. That's what I like. And then, because there are a lot of guys that I stay in contact with, just, I'm sure any reporter who you got to know from there, and like, and they leave, and like, you still stay in touch, and you want them to know, like, you don't want to use guys, right? You want them to know, like, you build a relationship, and you want that to continue as much as it can. And so that's where it happens. And yes, sometimes it's going to lead to a story that fans might not like, or might not look good for certain things. By and large, though, it's not about that. It's about the trust, and it's about, again, any relationship you have, it takes work. You can't just do that. In our jobs, you need to have that. It's
especially important building those relationships. And I thought it was a good point that you brought up too, is, from a player's perspective, if you feel like you were portrayed unfairly or inaccurately, if we only have those podiums, not every player comes up every week, and to only have them once a week, if it happens the day after, you don't get a chance to say anything outside of, Twitter or social media to counter that. And that's not fair to them either. Like both sides need to be held accountable. And that's important.
Yeah. And last thing on this for me, like, it's usually in those locker rooms, it's not I think people think like there's this warring factions of media and players. And it's usually not like that. I mean, the experience for me has been very, very good. And there's going to be some guys who don't like you, don't want you in there, and they'll let you know it. All right. By and large, it's always usually a good experience as far as getting to know guys and the value of those sessions. And again, like, they can pull you aside and say, you were wrong here. And I'm okay to hear that. Believe it or not, despite the reputation I have, I am not perfect, Nicki. I'm not. I'm gonna admit this right here on this podcast for the first time. And I can tell. Listen, your dogs are shocked. They're not even speaking now. So,
oh my God,
I didn't mean to throw you.
You saved this for the very end of the pod. Like, come on.
Well, I want them to listen to the end, but now they have a reason to wait to the end. Wow. But I'm going to admit that right here. So, but like I've told coaches before, like a coach will say, like, you had it wrong with this. Like, then tell me. I'm okay with that. Tell me. I want to. My job is not to be arrogant; it's to be right and accurate.
Exactly.
So, so if you're telling me that we didn't do this, this is not what happened. Like, all right, then later in the week, I'll make sure that I write it the right way. And that's all I. You're the same way, which is why I like hanging around you, because you're the same way, that you just want to be honest and accurate. And that's it. So anyway, that's our little reporter sermon for the day. So there you go. Nicki, I told you you're aces.
Thanks, man. Thanks. I'm
I
glad
want-
Joey and Louie got a
I want to
cameo.
sound as old as possible. When it's either peach, you're a peach or you're aces. One of those two. There you go. Thanks,
Keim.
Nicki. You're awesome. Thanks. Hey, everybody, it's John Keim. Do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, and I'll continue to bring you guests who provide excellent insight into the Washington Commanders. And while you're here, check out the other terrific content on the Ampire Media Network, including Inside the Cap with Joel Corey and All's Caps with Steve Wino and former Washington Capitol Carl Alsner. Go ahead, hit that subscribe button. Thank you.